Welcome to Garden Wise Adventures. My name is Malie, and today we're on video number 19 of my Beginning Gardener series. And today we're going to talk about how to fertilize your indoor potted plants before you plant them out in the garden. Now, before we talk about how to fertilize plants, we need to talk about why you need to fertilize your seedlings before we put them outside. Now, this is a pot full of new seeds. I have them planted in seed starting mix, and this seed starting mix is what is called sterile. Now, when I say sterile, what it means is it's just peat moss and perlite, and there are no nutrients and no microorganisms in this soil. Now, that is the best thing for the soil because the roots are very tender, and you run the risk of burning them if there's too much fertilizer in that. And they don't need the fertilizer at this point. All the nutrients they need to get off to a good start are in that little seed. Now, these seedlings are the next stage up, and they've been transplanted into a regular potting mix. Now, there are so many different kinds of potting mixes, and some of them contain fertilizers in them already that are ready-made potting mixes with fertilizer in them, and some are sterile and don't have any nutrients in them. And it's important to know which potting mix you're using so you don't add too much extra fertilizer if it's not needed. Now, the soil that I've used in this mix is coconut coir, perlite, and a little bit of compost. Now, the compost has a little bit of nutrients in it, and it will last for these plants for a little while. Probably the first 3 or 4 weeks of growth, they should be fine. And now that we've talked about potting soil and talked a little bit about what to look for there, let's talk about fertilizers and what kind of fertilizers to use. Now, there is a whole range of different kinds of fertilizers, and one way to categorize them is the organic fertilizers, such as this Espoma plant tone. Another one is a seaweed fertilizer. These are organic fertilizers. Now, when I say organic, I mean fertilizers that are created from something that occurs in nature. For example, manures or blood meal, alfalfa, seaweed. Those are the things that occur in nature, and they can be used as fertilizers because they have some nutrients. Now, take this seaweed fertilizer here. It has trace amounts of nutrients. It has a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of phosphorus, and a little bit of potassium. Now, I don't generally use organic fertilizers in my pots, although there is a little bit of an exception to that. When I mix my potting soil, I'll mix a little bit of this earthworm castings, and it has 1% nitrogen, so that is not a lot of nitrogen. And then I'll also mix in like a handful or two of this Espoma. Now, because I understand how organic fertilizers work, I think that's more a little bit out of habit than something that's really actually going to help the plants very much. And the reason I say that is because organic fertilizers need to be broken down by microorganisms before they're actually available to the plants. And if you have a sterile plant media, like a cocoa coir based or peat moss based potting soil, it's not going to have the microorganisms in it to break down the fertilizers. Now, maybe compost and earthworm castings will have a little bit of those microorganisms, but it's not going to break down the fertilizer fast enough for the plants to be able to use it for the 6 to 8 weeks that they're going to be in that pot. So that's when I turn to the synthetic fertilizers. Now, a lot of people have a little bit of a reaction to synthetic fertilizers, but what synthetic fertilizers are is they are basically fertilizers that are synthesized by people. So they're basically synthesized fertilizers. But what is good about them is their nutrients are in a form where the plants can utilize them immediately. Now, one thing that is not widely understood is that the organic fertilizers need to be broken down into this exact form for the plants to be able to utilize it. So the plants have no idea whether or not the nutrients that you're giving them are this form or this form. When they're in this form, they can't use it until it's broken down into this form. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I'm not opposed to using the synthetic fertilizers, especially in pots, because it is actually better for your plants. Now, when we're outside in the regular soil, I'm not opposed to using synthetic fertilizers, but using organic fertilizers more. And when I use the organic fertilizers, I know that they are not going to be immediately available to the plant. They have to be broken down first. So I apply them regularly throughout the season. And by regularly, I usually mean twice, once in the spring and once in the fall. The fall is to jumpstart the spring plants, and the spring fertilizer is for the fall plants, because that's the amount of time I think it would take to break the fertilizer down. So now that we understand fertilizers, let's talk a little bit about when I apply fertilizers and how much I apply. So as we talked about before the seeds sprout, we don't need any fertilizer because it'll actually be bad for the plants. So I don't add any fertilizer before the seeds sprout. Now when the seeds are this stage where they have their first leaf, which is the cotyledon, they really don't need any fertilizer at this point, so I end up leaving them. Now when they hit the next stage with their first true set of leaves, and this is what the first true set of leaves looks like, I start adding fertilizer. Now the fertilizer I like to add best is this Osmocote fertilizer. Now Osmocote fertilizer has all the nutrients plants need. It comes in a pelleted form that looks like this. And it's a slow release fertilizer, which means when you water it, the water washes out a little bit of the nutrients into the plant root zone and the plants can access it then. So this will last about 3 months, and for most of my plants, this is all they really need. Now when plants get a little bit larger, this is my goldenberry. It's a type of ground cherry. I like to actually grow these plants out a little bit longer because they take a long time to mature and fruit in my garden. So I end up potting these up into a gallon pot before I put them out into the garden. So because they're in the pots a lot longer than some of these other little seedlings, I do end up fertilizing these a little bit more. And what I like to do is add a liquid fertilizer. Now this is a powdered liquid fertilizer. You mix it with water, stir it up, and then pour it on your plants. So once my seedlings that need a little more fertilizer, like peppers, have 2 or 3 true leaves, then I will add liquid fertilizer at half strength. And that just seems to give me stronger, healthier plants. Once the plants reach the size of this kale here, this is a kale that I grow and I harvest inside. This is meant for harvest. I will fertilize the kale with a nitrogen-based fertilizer, which is this one. That's basically what leafy greens need, is mostly nitrogen. I will fertilize that every 2 weeks, and that seems to do really well for these plants, and that's along with the Osmocote. Now if I have extra hungry plants, like this pepper right here, and I'll show you the peppers that are forming on it, it's flowering and it's fruiting, and it needs a little bit more. Peppers are actually very hungry plants, so I will add a mixture of a nitrogen-based fertilizer plus a fertilizer that contains more phosphorus and potassium, and I will do that weekly. So that gives this plant enough nutrients to be able to flower and fruit for me. Now there's a specialty fertilizer that I use especially on my tomatoes and peppers that are fruiting indoors. I don't use this outdoors, I don't use this on leafy greens, and I don't use it on seedlings. This is Cal Mag. Now it has calcium, magnesium, zinc, and a few other nutrients in it. And there's something in it, I'm not exactly sure exactly what it is, that my fruiting plants, my heavily fruiting plants, seem to really need and respond to well. When I add this, my plants do a lot better than if I don't add it. And I usually add this twice a month. And I just mix this in with my regular fertilizer. Now there is such a thing as too much fertilizer. If you add too much fertilizer, you risk burning your plants. If you start seeing a white film at the top of your soil that's not mold, or if you start seeing your plants burn around the edges, it could be that you've added too much fertilizer. And one way to remedy that is to water from the top, and water it so that the water flows out the bottom holes of your pot. And that will flush the nutrients out the bottom and help resolve that issue. So the things that I look for to know if my seedlings need more fertilizer is a slowing down in growth, if the leaves start to turn a little bit yellow, or if they turn yellow between the veins and the veins stay green. So I look for those signs to see if I need to add more fertilizer. So I would love to hear the fertilizers you use on your indoor seedlings and how often you fertilize and how do you know when you need to fertilize. I'm really interested to hear everybody else's routines. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you. If it has been helpful, please leave some comments below, like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and go have a wonderful garden adventure.